Theories of social reproduction. The life of a sellable product is simple. It sits on the shelf until it's sold. Then it gets consumed. The consumer consumes the soup that was once a tomato. Then both the tomato and the soup are gone. Empty shelves must be refilled with goods. The entire cyclic process shown here, produce the goods, consume the goods, and then replace the goods, is called reproduction in Marxian economics. Under capitalism, reproduction involves not just workers and consumers, but also a third group, the profit takers. We have here a single system, call it the capitalist mode of production, with two functionally different aspects: production for consumption on the one hand, and reproduction of what's been consumed on the other. Persons, like commodities, also have lifespans. Those who are gone must be reproduced. We don't mean cloning here. We mean replenishing the population, not literally reproducing a specific person. Who replenishes the population? It's not the stork, right? The population is replenished by giving birth and parenting. Like the reproduction of consumed goods, the reproduction of the departed human population is a constantly renewed cycle. The worker is, as Marx says, the capitalist's most indispensable means of production. If older workers were not replaced by younger workers, then who would produce the goods we need to buy to live? And if goods were not being produced and sold, then what profits would there be for the profit takers to take? But the material conditions under which birth and parenthood happen are very different depending on a person's circumstances. One worker and parent faces eviction if her employer denies her FMLA claim and withholds her pay. Another worker and parent confronts sex discrimination and transphobia and fears losing his rights. And on the other hand, there are those members of our society who never face anxiety over withheld paychecks, and who are secure in the knowledge that whatever laws may be passed, and however the high courts rule, access to reproductive freedom will always be in their reach as a consequence of their privilege. By the workers, we mean people who depend on a paycheck for survival. Marx says in Capital Volume 2, the working class has to live from hand to mouth. If you make your living by working, then you're what we call a worker. If you don't have to work, if it's possible for you to live solely on profits derived from your property, real estate, or a business you own, then you are not what we're calling a worker. Even if you spend 100+ hours a week at the office. If you don't need a job to survive solely because of what you own, then you are among what Marx called the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie. It's possible to argue forever about the finer distinctions here. How many different classes can we distinguish? What kind of fractions are there within each class? Let's not do that. Let's keep things simple and assume that there are only two classes, the workers and the owners, or the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie. Marx gives a name to this basic division of the population into workers and capitalists. He calls it the capital relation. Marx says that the capital relation is also reproduced. It's reproduced alongside commodities like cans of soup and toilet paper, all in the single process of commodity production. What does Marx mean here? Specifically, what exactly is being reproduced when the capital relation is reproduced and maintained? The wage labor system is being reproduced. That is, the system of capitalists owning factories where the workers work, and the workers themselves having no ownership stake in those factories. This system goes beyond factories, of course. Another example would be farms privately owned by corporate entities, worked by laborers who, again, have no ownership stake in the land. The same principle underlies both wage labor and capitalist agriculture. The workers own nothing but their bodies, their labor power, while the capitalists own the means of production, the factories, the land. As we've seen, the workers themselves must also be reproduced. So must the capitalists. The reproduction of the capital relation means the reproduction of all three elements: the workers, the capitalists, and the grand division into the working and capitalist classes, a division that takes the form of wage labor. Marx's theory of reproduction helps us conceptualize how class rule is reproduced through the continually renewed process of economic reproduction. It's natural to ask whether other forms of rule or domination are reproduced by economic processes in an analogous way. Engels wrote at length about the economic domination of women in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which was published in 1884. Engels, along with Marx, saw the family as a kind of microcosm in which social antagonisms, including class division, appeared, as he put it, in miniature. As the quote here shows, Engels saw the relation between husband and wife as being similar to the relation between the bourgeoisie. No, more than that, more than similar. He saw the relation between husband and wife as being of the same type as the relation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Engels traces back the institution of male domination to ancient Rome. In Rome, the relation between husband and wife was one of pure and simple ownership. Let's jump forward through history a millennium or two and see what becomes of this relation after the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant was Hegel's predecessor in the great chain of German idealist philosophers. He wrote extensively on ethics, law, politics, and international relations. He had some strange ideas about sexual ethics. He appeared to understand sexual activity as tantamount to using each other's bodies. For example, he said that although it is never okay to use another human being as a means to an end, two wrongs, in the case of sex, make a right, so it's fine that sexual partners use one another in the bedroom. Very strange. If this line of thinking makes any sense at all, it can maybe be understood in terms of the legal right to usage. Deleuze and Guattari point out that Kant defined marriage, also a kind of strange idea that marriage needed Kant to define it formally. Kant defined marriage as reciprocal ownership of your spouse's sexual organs. Deleuze and Guattari go on to remind us that the terms of service, so to speak, of the marriage contract were established legally in terms of what may be appropriated from the body of the wife. Appropriated may seem too polite a word for it. What made the marriage of Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell an emancipated marriage was that Henry rejected the so-called right to the custody of his wife's person, and in particular agreed not to attempt to impose the dictates of his sexual desires on his wife. The radical position in the 1870s was to advocate voluntary motherhood. How times have changed. Compare this to the modern-day phrase, forced pregnancy. Advocates of voluntary motherhood in the 1870s were seen as audacious, outrageous, and outlandish. They were, after all, arguing against a literally ancient tradition of regarding women as property, or at least as being subject to certain property rights claimed over their bodies by men. American communist and noted feminist theorist Angela Davis does not see the struggle for reproductive rights as something separate and apart from the struggle to emancipate the working class. Davis explicitly links reproductive freedom with political power. She says, indeed, if women remained forever burdened by incessant childbirths and frequent miscarriages, they would hardly be able to exercise the political rights they might win. Reproductive freedom is a precondition for political agency. As a comrade put it, a prerequisite for membership in a political community. How do we explain male domination? This phenomenon, which has replicated itself over 6 continents and who knows how many millennia. We could give a moral or a psychological explanation. We could say that those who oppress women hate women, and perhaps this is true. But Marxists typically don't like for their explanations to rely on moral judgment, however clear and correct the moral judgment may be. Marx himself preferred material explanations, not in terms of motivations or preferences or feelings, but in terms of concrete configurations of relations between human beings. Accordingly, male domination can be understood as a social relation that is explained as the appropriation of the means of human reproduction. Among these means of reproduction, we include, at minimum, the reproductive anatomy of the birthing parent. The appropriation of the use of reproductive anatomy can be carried out through state law that causes your body to be treated as if someone else owns it. Forced pregnancy is the use of the body without compensation, unpaid, coerced reproductive labor. All non-consensual appropriation is appropriation by force, in this case by state force. Bottom line, persons must never be treated as property. The right to bodily autonomy is universal and well established in international law. The Wikipedia entry on bodily integrity has more on how the right to bodily and mental integrity is interpreted in various countries. The UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentions aspects of the right to bodily integrity, which Article 6 supplements by promising that everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. These are certainly very fine words, as are so many of the promises of the bourgeois liberal tradition. But as Ralph Miliband put it in his book Marxism and Politics, the task of Marxist politics is to defend freedoms which, however inadequately and precariously, form part of bourgeois democracy. This must surely include the right to be free from dehumanizing treatment. What is socialism for? What, in the final analysis, do we believe socialism would provide for humanity? Liberals believe a better world is possible too. For the classical liberal, in the best possible world, every individual is sovereign over themselves, body and mind, as John Stuart Mill wrote. When a comrade first showed me this quote, I said, well, that's basically what I believe. But then I got to noticing this word, sovereign. As socialists, we should reject any claim of individual sovereignty. Sovereignty, which is not collective, is a recipe for the disproportionate accumulation of wealth, which, once established and transformed into an enduring personal or class privilege, ultimately imposes domination on the less privileged members of society. We cannot all be princesses with feather-top pillows. Someone must collect the feathers. Someone must craft the pillow. Moreover, the status of queen or princess or slave is socially acquired and maintained. On a desert island with no other people around, there are no social relations, and no one is a princess, or, for that matter, a slave. These aren't intrinsic properties of the person. These labels, these roles, are social relations. The point of socialism, according to Engels at least, is to provide all human beings with the opportunity to exercise and develop all their powers and faculties in complete freedom. But crucially, this opportunity does not rest on a foundation of personal sovereignty. Rather, the possibility of universal opportunity for personal growth and development depends on the collectivization of industry. We have enough, and we can continue to make enough to go around so that no one is hungry, so that no one goes without shelter. Socialism means that human needs, like land and bread, are provided publicly. That's what socialism is. But what socialism is for, the purpose of providing for everyone's needs, is personal development. The purpose of socialism is emancipation. Emancipation from what? From servitude. This slide compares forced pregnancy with other forms of exploitation. Intersectional solidarity. Property rights over female slaves' bodies. Excerpts from Angela Davis, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. Chapter 1, Women, Race, and Class. Throughout the South, state legislatures adopted the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother. 1 year after importation of Africans was halted, a South Carolina court ruled that slaves had no legal claims whatever on their children. Consequently, according to this ruling, children could be sold away from their mothers at any age because the young of slaves stand on the same footing as animals. In the eyes of the slaveholders, slave women were not mothers at all. They were simply instruments guaranteeing the growth of the slave labor force. They were breeders, animals whose monetary value could be precisely calculated in terms of their ability to multiply their numbers. Slaveholders naturally sought to ensure that their breeders would bear children as often as biologically possible, but they never went so far as to exempt pregnant women and mothers with infant children from the fields. Expediency governed the slaveholders' postures toward female slaves. When it was profitable to exploit them as if they were men, they were regarded in effect as genderless. But when they can be exploited, punished, and repressed in ways suitable only for women, they were locked into their exclusively female roles. Like the majority of slave men, slave women, for the most part, were field workers. I've included some pictures of Aunt Jemima pancake syrup over the years. Notice the idealization of Black women's situation in the Old South. Nowadays, the company is too embarrassed to even use the name Aunt Jemima. Women were not too feminine to work in coal mines, in iron foundries, or to be lumberjacks and ditch diggers. When the Santee Canal was constructed, slave women were a full 50% of the workforce. This is reminiscent of the horrendous utilization of white female labor in England as described in Marx's Capital. In England, women are still occasionally used instead of horses for hauling canal boats because the labor to produce horses and machines is an accurately known quantity, while that required to maintain the women of the surplus population is below all calculation. Proportionally, more Black women have always worked outside their homes than have their white sisters. The pandemic reminded us of this fact. Removal of white women from the productive sphere, the effect of the factory system on the economic role of women. During the pre-industrial era, women had been hand manufacturers, producing fabric, clothing, candles, soap, and practically all the other family necessities. They had been productive workers within the home economy, and their labor had been no less respected than men's. Compare with Angela Davis's description of housework as invisible, repetitive, exhausting, unproductive, and uncreative. The Industrial Revolution resulted in white women's lives being radically changed. By the 1830s, many of women's traditional economic tasks were being taken over by the factory system. the industrialization of the economy eroded women's prestige in the home, a prestige based on their previously productive and absolutely essential labor. Their social status began to deteriorate accordingly. As workers, women had at least enjoyed economic equality, but as wives, they were destined to become servants to their husbands. The situation of the white housewife was full of contradictions. The more women's domestic duties shrank under the impact of industrialization, the more rigid became the assertion that women's place is in the home. Early intersectional solidarity. White abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke-Weld. More than any other women in the campaign against slavery, the Grimkes urged the constant inclusion of the issue of women's rights. At the same time, they argued that women could never achieve their freedom independently of black people. The Grimke sisters had such a profound consciousness of the inseparability of the fight for black liberation and the fight for women's liberation, they were never ensnared in the ideological snare of insisting that one struggle was absolutely more important than the other. They realized the dialectical character of the relationship between the two causes. Angela Grimke-Weld said, "I want to be identified with the Negro. Until he gets his rights, we shall never have ours." Social reproduction feminisms, 1969 to present. Social reproduction feminism is a fusion of Marxism and feminism. Its origins can be traced back to the utopian socialists of the 1800s. Marx and Engels formalized the theory and applied it to offer economic, sociological, and anthropological analyses of the institution of male domination. But although they viewed the abolition of patriarchy as central to the socialist project, the early Marxist, quote-unquote, scientific socialists tended to focus on what they called productive labor, by which they meant labor that produces an exchangeable physical item, a commodity. So-called service workers, including healthcare, education, the performance arts, and food service, are hardly even mentioned in Marx's Capital. The historically varied blend of productive and service-oriented labor, characteristic of domestic work, would have to wait until the late 1960s to be rigorously analyzed by thinkers in the Marxist tradition. Margaret Benston's 1969 article, The Political Economy of Women's Lives, advanced the thesis that, quote, household labor, including childcare, constitutes a huge amount of socially necessary production, but is not usually considered real work, since it is outside of trade and the marketplace, end quote. Social reproduction feminism, SRF, has continued to develop, incorporating and reflecting concerns from other feminist traditions. See Susan Ferguson's 2016 article on intersectionality and SRF. Let's see how three social reproduction feminists articulate the core principles of SRF. As Ferguson says, SRF is not simply concerned with a vague inequality between men and women, but instead focuses on the dynamics of a single logic in which patriarchy and capitalism are co-constituted and reproduced. Vogel distinguishes between the character of women's oppression in the propertied and in the working classes. She says, in propertied classes, women's oppression flows from their role in the maintenance and inheritance of property. In subordinate classes, female oppression derives from women's involvement in processes that renew direct producers, the workers, as well as their involvement in economic production. Bhattacharya lays out a general call to action as follows. Our solution as Marxist revolutionaries is not simply to talk about the importance of class struggle, but to link the struggles of the formal economy to those outside of it. The best way to fight for women's rights in the sphere of production is through our labor organizations, but the working class doesn't work only in its workplace. We provide the analytical linkage between the two spheres of the single system through Marxist theory, and act as a tribune of the oppressed, particularly when the fight is not generalized to the workplace. How do trans people fit into all this social reproduction stuff? This is just my take, just one person. I'm not speaking for DSA or any other group. A key difference between male domination of women and the subjugation of transgender people is that, in the latter case, the extinction of the group is often sought by its oppressors. Trans people's bodies, when directly regulated by the state, are regulated not just in their aspect of being potential biological means of reproduction, but also in their very existence. That is, trans people face genocide, if not in their literal extinction as human beings, then at least culturally. The principle at work in state policies that deny transgender care or force detransition is akin to the principle, kill the Indian, spare the man. The correct strategy for the socialist left is not one of intersection, but of union. An injury to one, as they say, is an injury to all. Compare Ralph Miliband's dual power strategy of strong Marxist reformism. He says, what we need is a flexible and complex network of organs of popular participation, working alongside but independently of the state.